Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this practical takeaways from the Procurement Act 2023, which has been presented by us here at Burkitt's. I'm Claire Jones, and this is my colleague Mike Caution.
Hi, good morning.
And we're together part of our public sector team here, and we're going to be your trainers today. Just a few housekeeping rules or things to tell you about is that there will be the opportunity to do Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. To let you know also that this session is going to be recorded and slides will also be available to you within a few days after today. So if we can get started. We've all, no doubt, had a lot of procurement training over the last year. It seems that it's taken a little while for the Act to come into force. So what are we going to talk to you about today? Well, we're going to cover some practical takeaways that we've come across through actually applying the Act over the last couple of months. And we're going to focus on the 4 key areas set out there on the slide. So I'm going to be talking to you about strategy and market engagement. Mike will then talk to you about approaches to sourcing and conduct of the procurement. I'll come back to talk to you a little bit about contract management, and then Mike will finish with social value at the end. So I think it's helpful to start with strategy and market engagement. And what I've done on this slide is really set out 4 key areas or 4 key legal points in your procurement cycle. So the first one there is the pipeline notice. So this is if you are letting over £100 million of contracts in the year, all contracts over £2 million will need to be published in the pipeline notice. However, having said that, actually, I think it's really helpful for all your procurements to start quite early and have a good think about those at the start of each year to see what you're going to be doing throughout the coming procurement year. The second big step there in the purple is the service of a tender notice or a transparency notice or a dynamic market notice. And I think what I've done on the slide is put in this top box on the top right hand side, the things that you really need to be thinking about between your service of the pipeline notice and the service of your tender notice. And there's quite a number of things that you'll need to have a think about there. So before going out to tender, you need to think about complying with the various Procurement Act duties that are set out in the Act, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. You can think about serving a preliminary market engagement notice if you're going to do that. Consider your routes to procurement before you serve your tender notice, and actually think about KPIs. The reason that they're here is whilst they're part of your contract management tools, you of course need to put your KPIs into the contract at the very start. So there's quite a lot going on there at the front of the cycle. When you serve your tender notice, and if we have a look in the box in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, when you serve that notice, you have to be satisfied that the information contained within it is sufficient to allow suppliers to prepare their tender and that the requirements set out in that notice are sufficiently clear and specific. Obviously, it could be in the notice or the associated tender documents. So there's quite a lot of work to get to that point. So when we talk about procurement strategy, it's working out how best to manage that process. We then go through the procurement process and end up with our contract award notice. And then eventually at the end of your cycle, you'll be serving your termination notice. And that's really the contract management phase between that quadrant 3 and 4 on that circle. So there's distinct phases, and we'll try and touch on all of those today and talk to you about some things that we've been thinking about. So let's just recap to start with on some key duties that we have to think about beforehand, and this is before we go out to tender. So a covered procurement now, the Act talks about covered procurement, and that is defined now as the award, entry into and management of a public contract. So that's really this Procurement Act is doing an end-to-end of the life of your contract rather than just focusing on the start. We've got our general duties now that we will be familiar with under Section 12, and we've got the National Procurement Policy Statement under Section 13, duty to consider lots, duty to consider conflict at the outset and during the life of the contract. We've got to think about setting KPIs for contracts over £5 million, although not applicable to light touch contracts. And we have to think about our record keeping requirements. So that's sort of a really quick overview of all the sorts of things we need to be thinking about at the outset. If we turn to transparency next, we need to be transparent in the conduct of the procurement process and throughout the life of the contract. And the way this is dealt with in the Act really is through notices. And it won't be a surprise to you all to know that there's a lot of notices now under the contract. We're not going to be going through those in detail today, but I'm sure that you've all been looking at those quite a lot back in your authorities. So on this slide, we're just going to be I've set out some key notices at the outset that you might need to be thinking about. So there's the pipeline notice that I've already mentioned, and that has to be served annually. But I do think, as I said at the outset, it's a really good opportunity to think about all your procurements. When you think of that list of duties that I've put on the previous slide, there's a lot to do for each procurement that you go through. And the earlier you start thinking about some of these things, then the better it will be. And you'll buy yourself a little bit of time when you try to go out to tender. There's the planned procurement notice. It's a service you may serve if you want to go out to procurement. It's not a must, it's a may. But we turn to what I think is a really important point in the Procurement Act, and I'm going to go into it in some more detail as we go through, is this preliminary market engagement notice. So this is new. The PCR didn't have this, so I think it's worth spending a bit of time having a look at that and actually thinking about how the clients that we've been sort of working with over the last couple of months, it's become, I think, more and more clear that preliminary market engagement is going to be key to success in applying the Procurement Act. So the idea is that with preliminary market engagement notice, you publish that before you publish a tender notice, or you can publish that at the same time. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a minute. You then have your tender notice and associated tender documents, or transparency notice if you're making a direct award, or a dynamic market notice if you're setting up a dynamic market. So I think the other important point with strategy is to think about when you're deciding how you're going to go about going out to tender, think about the routes you have available. We've got a list there, and it's quite a detailed slide. I'm not going to go through it all in total, but there's some real key points about each process listed out on that slide. So we've got the open procedure, which is really similar to how we were dealing with the PCR. So there's no down selection, no refinement of the award criteria. You can only modify the terms of that procurement before the deadline for submitting tenders, subject to the compliance with the Procurement Act when you do that. It's for very simple procurements. We've then got this other camp, and that's the competitive flexible procedure. And that's really anything else, a competitive procurement, and you've basically got the ability to design your own procurement. And I know that Mike will come on to talk about this. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. It sounds good because you can do what you like, but you do have to be quite careful in telling bidders what it is you're going to do. And I know that Mike's going to talk a lot about that because he's been doing a lot of work with clients on that over the last couple of months. So you can modify the terms of your competitive flexible under the competitive flexible procedure. You can make a modification to your tender before tenders are due for submission, or request to participate is due. So that's at the very, very outset. And there are circumstances during the procurement process where you are entitled to make modifications subject to the restrictions in the Act that the modification can't be substantial. All of that, though, needs to be done before the final tender is submitted as part of that process for assessment. I just would note that particularly with strategic projects under the old rules, we saw a lot of competitive dialogue process used. The process has changed for that somewhat, in that you can't now award the contract and under the Act start to negotiate. That has to be done up front. And that's something to think about when you're structuring and designing your procurement. You just need to make sure that you bear that in mind and that you deal with that as part of your procurement process. We've got frameworks again. There's not a huge amount different to think about there. We have open frameworks though, which are new. So they can be a framework that's open for up to a maximum of 8 years. You can open them yearly or as often as you like, but you do have to open them during the first 3 years and then the subsequent 5 years. So that's something to think about, particularly if you know that you've got the same type of service that you want to be provided over a very long period of time and you don't think the market is going to change hugely in that period, then an open framework might be quite a good tool for that. We've also got dynamic markets, which I think the thing to note about that is you can only award a contract on a dynamic market by going through a competitive procedure. So that's something to bear in mind. Direct award, obviously we've still got that. You need to think about your justifications being met if you're going to make a direct award and before you serve a transparency notice. And there could be an exemption to the procurement rules altogether that you want to apply. I think it's interesting under the Procurement Act that a covered procurement, and I've got some more information about that in a minute. A covered procurement is a procurement that isn't exempt. So if one of those exemptions at the back is going to apply, you do need to think about that quite early on. And I would say justify why you think that exemption does apply, record details of that, so that if anybody asks you as an authority why you didn't go out to procurement or go out to tender, you have your reasons for that set out in a clear way. So there's quite a lot to think about, I would say, with that. Which is one of the reasons why I think that starting early is going to be of benefit, particularly for some of these more complex procurements. So for most of the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about procurement in this section. I'm going to talk about preliminary market engagement because it's coming up time and time again, actually, when we're talking to people, particularly with those strategic procurements, particularly things like land-based procurements. I think it's really important that you engage with the market early for some of those things. So as a contracting authority, I've set out, and I talked to you before in the session about, as a contracting authority, you must not serve a tender notice unless you're satisfied that those criteria on the slide have been met. So what that means is at the point that you're going out to market, you do have to have a broad sense and enough detail in there that your tenderers can come back with a sensible response. And I think that's really important when we think about, even if you can later amend your procurement, at the point you go out to tender, you do still need to feel and be satisfied that you have got enough information just to kick the process off. And part of the way in which that can be done, if we get it back, is through preliminary market engagement. So what the rules say in section 16 and 17 is that as a contracting authority, you may engage with suppliers and other people before you publish your tender or transparency notice. And examples of the purposes of the PME notice are given in section 16 of the Act so that you can read them. It doesn't say, though, what that type of engagement might look like. So that means that it could take the form of more informal discussions that could still be caught as preliminary market engagement. I think having spoken to clients about that, particularly where procurement teams aren't contacted until quite late in the process, it's making officers in the councils or local authorities aware that there is a notice that needs to be served for PME. Talking to various clients that we've spoken to over the last couple of months, it's not always been clear to officers who have actually gone out and engaged the market without getting advice from their procurement teams and then found that they had to serve a notice. So I just flag that as an issue.
So sometimes I'll have clients come up and say, oh, we've done some soft market testing. So
yeah.
put on the website, for example. And then, as you say quite rightly, it's a really key area to be careful about, because in effect, you've still got to think about leveling the playing field for all potential bidders, that there's a risk, or at least perceived risk, of giving someone an advantage because they've taken part in this select market engagement that you haven't told the world about.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, like, the notices will need to say whether or not you've done any market engagement.
And there is always going to be a grey area. So, if you know nothing whatsoever about a particular market you're about to enter in and want to educate yourself in a broad sense, that may be okay. But it doesn't take very long for that to then stray into the pre-market engagement territory. So I do flag that as something that's come up quite a few times for us. Just note that, as Mike just alluded to, that your PME can't be conducted in a way to give a supplier an unfair advantage or to distort competition. So that would be scenarios, for example, if you're talking to one particular supplier, setting out what you want, describing the situation, and then them telling you how to design your procurement so that they might win it. That is quite an extreme example, but that would be unfair. And you just have to be really careful when you start straying into that territory to pull back and have a think about it. If you are going to carry out PME, and it's very much encouraged, if anybody's read the guidance to the Act, PME is all over it, and the government was very keen for authorities to conduct preliminary market engagement. So if you're going to do it, that's fine, but you do have to publish a PME notice before you publish a tender notice. And if you don't do that in your tender notice, you have to set out reasons why you didn't previously serve a PME notice. And the idea is that the notice is there to invite suppliers to participate in your market engagement and help to secure compliance with your Section 12 duties. That is, it could be really helpful in providing evidence for value for money, level the playing field, talk to the market about the sort of structuring that they might be willing to accept with your contracts. It's just really a very, very helpful process. And it also will help you ensure that your competitive, flexible procedure that you put forward is proportionate. So when you're designing your competitive, flexible procedure, and I know that Mike will come on to talk about this, it does need to be a proportionate process, bearing in mind that SMEs, you need to encourage them to participate. So PME can really help with that and actually narrow the issues. And at the end, I'll come on to talk about some examples that we've come across with that. So on this slide, I've set out some quotes from the guidance. I have to say, having trawled through the various bits of guidance to the Act, some, I think, for me, are more successful than others. So the guidance on PME is actually, I find, quite helpful. It's really well set out, and it does provide some really helpful guidance. And we'll come on to some other guidance in a minute that I don't particularly think has achieved the same level of success. But certainly on the PME, these are quotes. So in the guidance, they're very clear that PME is particular importance, given that you have had this flexibility to design and tailor your own procedures. The information gathered can be invaluable, important tool for achieving value for money. There's quite interesting comments there about making your preliminary market engagement accessible to all. So there's some comments in there about having online sessions so that people don't have to travel, which I thought was quite an interesting idea. And it's really clear, and I think it's the guidance. I have to say, actually, to pause just for a moment, the guidance isn't actually statutory guidance at the moment. And I'll revisit this when I talk about the contract management, because it could end up being a little bit of an issue. But to flag, whilst it's not statutory, it is the guidance we have. And in the guidance, the government have been really clear that they feel that non-publication of a preliminary market engagement notice before you do it and leaving it to the tender stage is meant to be, a real exception to the rule. What the intention is, clear from reading the guidance, is that you are publishing these notices to invite people to talk to you, rather than conducting the preliminary market engagement and then publishing in the tender notice. The Act doesn't say that. The Act doesn't actually tell you what reasonable reasons might be for leaving it till the tender notice, but the guidance almost fills that gap and sets out the expectation that unless you've got something like national security reasons, that the government would like everybody to be publishing these notices before the tender notice. On that slide, I've set out what preliminary market engagement might be and the purpose of it. So when you're thinking about your preliminary market engagement, the way to determine whether it is PME for the purposes of the Act is to look at the purpose. And there's some quite wide definitions on there. So if you're talking to the market for any of the purposes listed there, we're in the world of preliminary market engagement. So I thought it'd be useful, and I wanted to talk to you about some examples that we've been looking at where we've helped and advised clients on their procurement strategy. And the first question on that list is something that we sit down with clients, and when we're talking to them, is the very first question we ask. And this is really obvious if it's a simple case of that the authority wants to buy services, for example. But actually, with larger structures or more complex procurements, particularly ones involving land, investors, development and tenants, is sitting down and working out where those contractual relationships are going to be and who is buying what from whom, essentially. Is the authority buying something or is it supplying something? And that's the first question that we talk to clients about, and we sit down and map that out. The second question then is, when you've worked out what your contracts are and working out what you as an authority are actually buying, you decide whether any of the exemptions may apply. And again, on the slide, we've talked about the obvious ones, really. Strategic land-based transactions. So this comes up quite frequently with clients which are dealing with development of land, is that if our clients discuss it with us and they decide that actually what they really want to do is just sell the land, then that would be a land-based transaction, subject to, of course, applying the provisions of the Act to the circumstances. But it could be a land-based transaction, in which case they don't have to worry about the procurement at all, provided that they write down evidence and keep records of why they think that that land-based exemption applies. Other questions that have come up are vertical and horizontal arrangements. So if you're a public authority which is contracting with another public authority to deal with your public duties or public responsibilities, then that might be a horizontal arrangement. And if you work that out at the outset, it could be that you fall within the exemption and then the Procurement Act falls away. So that's really the second stage that we go through. Then we have a think about the type of thing you're buying. So is it a light touch contract? So some of the Act, the provisions of the Act don't apply to light touch contract. For example, certain provisions about frameworks don't apply, rules on KPIs don't apply. So determine that at that point. Then have a think about whether you're going to be making a direct award, having a look at the justifications for that, and work out if that's an option for you. And then if none of those apply and we're going down traditional procurement route, have a think about the structure that would best suit your procurement. So we looked at a previous slide on the various routes to procurement and things to have a think about. So this is where I think the PME comes in, and a lot of our discussions have been around that, to say, well, what is the market like for what you're seeking to buy? Yeah. Is it going to be static? Is the law all over the place and changing? If the law's changing really, really quickly, then, an 8-year open framework possibly is not going to be very helpful for you. Mm-hmm. If you want to make direct awards to people on a framework, then you're not going to be using a dynamic market. It's can you nail down your procurement sufficiently at the outset that you can have an open procedure, or have you got steps in there that you need a little bit of flexibility?
Yeah, and I'll come on onto the procedures, but I think, as Claire says, preliminary market engagement is really important, because oftentimes what we'll kind of get involved in as lawyers is kind of helping you kind of design the process and make sure you get best value for money. Although those conversations are always much more in a more advanced state for those that have conducted that preliminary market engagement, really understand the market. Obviously, from any procurement perspective, it's not just going to be a loyalty job. It's not just going to be a contract manager job. It's always going to be a sort of holistic approach. Your finance people, your policy people, your contract management people, and your procurement people, and of course the lawyers. But we would say that. So when you're approaching this, making sure that you've got a feel for what the market is after, and whether or not, when you're thinking about your requirement, that you're not just designing your requirement because that's how you think it should be delivered, because you might not know that there are other opportunities or other ways that you could deliver this. And then that helps then obviously develop your procurement strategy down the line, and you're not asking necessarily lawyers for example, whether it's right to do a particular way, because from our perspective, we're trying to get you in the best position possible to mitigate legal risk. But then it is that holistic approach that is really important to contracting and procurement.
Yeah, and I had a conversation with the client at the start of this week, which was really helpful. So he was at a very, very early stage before conducting the preliminary market engagement, and we talked through the procurement framework that the client had to work with, so that when he went out to market, he was asking the right questions, honing that procurement, and that was the one I'm thinking about as a strategic land-based procurement in a market where he wasn't sure whether it would be investor-led, developer-led, or land-based. And he's now going to go out and have those conversations, and I think he can have those in a really helpful way for him. So he'll then be able to really hone in on what he needs to go out to procure.
I should say I have had it in my experience where effectively you get market engagement that you don't want to hear. So the answer to that is always, well, okay, take it on board. Do think about it, and then if you're going to discount it, obviously there's no obligation for you to say, well, okay, just because the market said X, I now need to do X. It can still do Y. It just comes down, it just comes down to whether or not your procurement is attractive to the market.
Yeah, and we've all had situations where a client has gone out to market. So really a basic one that we had was a client had gone out to market for cleaning contract, and then after running the procurement had realised that a particular type of cleaning is quite bespoke and most players in the market don't do it. So they've basically unwittingly excluded a lot of the market just by including that. And it's a really simple example, but I think it's a good example of why PME would have been really helpful for them. Anyway, I think having spoken about that, I'm going to pass on to Mike to talk to you about approaches to sourcing and the conduct of your procurement.
So the next few slides are effectively going to sort of go into a bit more detail on some of the approaches that Claire has mentioned already. And what my intention will be is basically you've got these are kind of ready reckoner, and what I'll be talking to is more about my kind of practical takeaways and how effectively we've been sort of working within the rules. And so on the next slide, you'll effectively see the sort of the main bits that we'll talk about. So starting with conditions of participation and the very easily rolls to the tongue procurement specific questionnaire. We'll then talk a little about the open procedure, and then we'll spend a bit of time on the competitive flexible procedure with a quick bit on frameworks and dynamic markets and open frameworks. Obviously, if you've got any questions as we go through, feel free to put that in the chat. So without further ado, the first point that I'd sort of talk through, and this is all about the kind of first steps. So part of that procurement strategy where you're designing your procurement, I often get asked about the procurement specific questionnaire and the conditions of participation. And what tends to be a bit more of a stumbling block is really thinking about the kind of push and pull between what are the conditions of participation that are appropriate and proportionate to your procurement versus making sure that you actually get a good competitive procurement, and you've got actually that tension there that gives you or drives value for money at the end of it. So when thinking about sort of conditions of participation, obviously you've got, in the context of the procurement specific questionnaire, if you've not got that to hand, there is a template on the government pathway website, so I'd recommend that you do have a look at that. They've recently updated it. But thinking about the conditions of participation for your procurement, thinking about it in the same terms as what you would have done if you're familiar with using the selection questionnaire under the PCI public contracts regulations. So effectively, that importance between your conditions of participation are all about, can the supplier perform the contract? And that's opposed to how they will perform the contract. So make sure, and that's one of the key points I've got there at the bottom of the slide, that you are properly distinguishing between, say, accreditations that you might need for this particular procurement. So no one else can perform it unless they have a specific accreditation. And clearly that's going to be something of condition of participation. Versus, say, their delivery model. So great, how would you demonstrate innovation? Then we're clearly going into territory of award criteria. Please make sure that you're distinguishing between the two, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're effectively evaluating a tender at the condition of participation side. And there's case law under the PCR that talks of the importance of the distinction. And it's a fair bet to say that that would be the same case here. And so the other thing I'd just say on this point, on this slide as well, is around making sure that you're thinking about what is the economic and financial standing testing that you're going to do. And so you might think, well, okay, we have a particular approach within the authority, and oftentimes this will be sort of with your finance colleagues, but do reflect on it in terms of the contract that you're procuring. So oftentimes we'll see in the contract procedure rules, there'll be set limits on insurance, or there'll be certain requirements set out within your governing documents that say that this is the minimum you have to have. And what tends to happen is the minimum is just sort of popped in without much more thought. Going back to what Claire was talking about on the preliminary market engagement, clearly, if you're going to have a contract and then you're acquiring £10 million and your market can't get that insurance, or it's just not appropriate for services, then that's where your conditions of participation are really informed by that preliminary market engagement, making sure that you're setting the right gateways. And for image's sake, I have used a sort of starting block there as a kind of run to kind of illustrate the point that it's really thinking what that white line needs to be for your suppliers to go across. Don't need to.
I think as well with this comes up with the engagement of the SMEs. So and think of your Section 12 duties as an overarching guide. It might be that whilst big players in the market have got that insurance anyway, that it isn't necessary for that contract, and an SME could deliver the contract, but they just can't get the insurance you've asked for. Yeah. So I think it's just checking.
Yeah,
quite like you just said.
I've had that exactly same conversation just yesterday in terms of the new duty for observing whether there's any barriers to procurement for SMEs and making sure what you can do to reduce those. That's not to say that that's an absolute. So provided you can say and demonstrate why you've given thought to that and written it down as part of your record keeping under the Procurement Act, that you still proceed. But then, of course, it comes with the commercial sort of pros and cons of saying, well, we now set more gateway, likely to then limit the number of suppliers that are going to be interested. And that's not even taking into account any kind of shortlisting you might do. So you might then score the responses under the conditions of participation and the procurement specific questionnaire, either as pass fail or as an evaluation. So it's really trying to have a think about all of those hurdles that you're setting in the context of the Section 12 duties, in the context of what you're actually procuring, and make sure you're getting this right first time, because that tends to be somewhere where I see a lot of kind of clients kind of and ah and think, oh crikey, what do we need to do? And that's because they either haven't run preliminary market engagement, or they just need the time and space to think about it. And no doubt lots of you on the call will appreciate oftentimes that you're kind of beholden to the contract. So oftentimes procurements will need to happen within the next, say, 3 weeks on a very accelerated timescale, if I can put it like that. So these can be really challenging questions, but they're really important to kind of get right first, because otherwise the rest of procurement sort of stands and falls behind it. And so the next thing I just want to talk about, because it is kind of linked, and Claire will talk a bit about excluded and excludable later, but I just wanted to flag here about the kind of debarment side of things. So the key things from debarment, and apologies, you'll see on the screen perhaps the second part there, debarment. There is now a notification from the Procurement Review Unit. There's a very handy online form that you can complete if you're going to debar someone, or rather you've excluded someone and you need to refer them for debarment. If you've had a chance to look at the debarment list, I would recommend it, because it, and from a kind of cynical lawyer perspective, what effectively you have is something that's separate from the Wizzy digital central digital platform. I say Wizzy, as being literally just a template Excel document that you can just access by Googling debarment list. And so when you're checking the debarment list, that's what you need to check. So my kind of practical points from this are effectively make sure that your ITT or your the various iterations of invitation to participate, invitation to submit tenders, etc. Your core procurement documents give you specific rights to say we will check the debarment list throughout the procurement process, and make sure that you've included rights in there about notified about any changes to a bidder's tender, including whether they have been entered onto the list. So not only do you need to check it, I would recommend strongly that you include obligations on the bidder to also tell you if they're going to be if they're on it. The other part of this is then a slight grey area. So my current practice is to include rights for them to tell you if they're being investigated as part of it. So that is obviously untested. So part of that is going to be quite tricky, because provided I suppose the main key point here is provided you're giving yourself sufficient rights within your ITT around debarment, around checking the list, that makes your life a lot easier when you're having to kind of then have these conversations with suppliers. You might have seen obviously from the BBC News, etc., that the Minister is currently investigating those involved in Grenfell. So if you are doing a construction project, do make sure that you are checking the list, and then making a decision based on if they are listed or not. And as part of their response for the procurement questionnaire, they will be telling you, as part of their core supplier information, whether they have been entered onto the debarment list. But the kind of the other side of that is just making sure you've got enough rights within your within your procurement documents to make sure that they are telling you about any changes as well. And so this slide basically summarizes the process of debarment. The key takeaways here is that you are pretty much on tracks. As soon as you are referring for debarment, you will then get a notice through from potentially the procurement review unit to basically go along and provide information. So do get all your ducks in a row to make sure that you have really good justified reasoning for why you're going to debar someone and start the process. As you can no doubt appreciate, that's going to be a huge trigger for litigation. So it's really like this is really super important to make sure that you've documented everything, make sure you have everything in a nice, easy, accessible format. So when you get these kind of notices back asking for further information, that you can just send it through and comply with the time frames that send it through. And obviously we're yet to see once a body's been entered onto what that will entail for further litigation for that particular body, or actually just entering into public contracts with that public bodies or that particular body. So it's an area to keep an eye on, yes, and also make sure you've got sufficient rights within your ITT to make sure that you're checking the debarment list and they tell you about the debarment list.
We're all just holding our breath, waiting to see what happens with the first one.
So I get quite excited about debarment. So I'll just talk quickly about open procedure. So I'll talk more around my kind of experience of how the open procedure has been used. Obviously, we're no different really territory to what you would have seen under the PCR in terms of open procedure. This, though, I do have conversations with clients saying, well, is this more open or should this be more competitive flexible? So the way, and we'll talk about competitive flexible in a few slides time, but I suppose the key point remains, if your solution is effectively off the shelf, if it's going to be really straightforward, really simple, all your contract terms are nailed down, you don't want any amendments to the contract, but also you're not anticipating amendments to the contract, that you're effectively opening your shop, allowing anyone to come in, and you can have conditions of participation still, but they have to be proportionate. But it's no different to how effective the open procedure was under the PCR single stage. I've included the timescales under here, so you'll note that there's an interesting slight reduction in timescales to 25 days, provided you're sending everything out electronically at the same time as the tender notice. So the key part here is that, again, for the open procedure, it's sort of non-complex, off the shelf, and a fairly straightforward process. So that's kind of takes us then to what happens to modifying an open procedure. So Claire's kind of has referred to it previously, but on this slide I've just set out the sort of the bit more detail around the kind of time limit. So do have a think about whether or not, I suppose the key point from this slide is if you're modifying the open procedure before submission of tenders, what impact that has on the timeframes that you set. So again, very similar to how it was under the PCR, that if you're providing important information that actually is important for informing bids, then clearly that requires some reflection about, well, actually now we've given this at the 11th hour, maybe we should now extend for an additional 5 days, 7 days, whatever's proportionate to the amount of information that you're giving. And this comes back round again to the record keeping. So as part of all of this, we no longer have a nice world where we've got a Regulation 84 report, or you might have called it an award report, where you're documenting all your decisions as part of it. You've now got a general obligation under the Procurement Act to record material decisions. So when you're extending your, well, if you're having to modify first your procurement and then extend timeframes, and this is something that you should be recording why you did that as well, to make sure that it's not just because there's a bidder that you want to win hasn't yet submitted a tender. And so really making sure that your decision making is objectively justifiable.
I think just on that, we've had situations where possibly our clients haven't engaged the market as much as they should, and go through the open procedure and publish the contract and realise that the terms included in the contract are not acceptable to the market. The timeframes do very quickly start slipping if that is the case, because of the requirement to give everybody a reasonable period of time within which to look at the tender and submit the response.
Yeah, and obviously then the tension is the incumbent service provider. So clearly, if you're then challenged by the deadlines of your own procurement, and obviously this applies just the same as to competitive flexible procedure is open, is that challenge around, okay, well, now we've got an incumbent contract, there could be TUPE implications. So whoever wins the contract will have the employee's TUPE over. But you might have a situation then where you've anticipated that your incumbent contract will end in, say, September, and the procurement will mean that you award for September. But then you're now thinking, well, actually, we need to amend. So when you're thinking about extending timeframes, try, and no doubt we'll do this anyway, have that holistic approach and think, actually, in terms of our operational stability, we now need to think about what is our justification potentially for extending the incumbent contract to manage that commercial relationship. That's obviously that wider legal, not just legal question, and seeing what you can rely on for the sort of the extensions that are permissible under the Procurement Act. We won't cover extensions under or the sort of permitted modifications in this session, but if you've got any questions, obviously feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, we will mention the only thing to note with that to add is that you now have to serve your contract termination notice at the end of the contract. So if you sort of down the line, we might be in a world where everybody knows because you've had to publish the details that your contract's due to end on one day, and the contract termination notice shows that it actually didn't, and it was extended. So I think there's a high level of scrutiny over contract end now.
Absolutely. And also the other change, obviously, from the PCR, where you were publishing a modification notice after the change, now obviously you're doing that prior to the change. So it replaces the VEET notice, but you're now having to do a notice before you actually consider a modification. So I've just got on the next slide the key considerations. So summarising a lot of kind of what we've just been talking about, I guess the key points here again are just making sure that you're having time to reflect on the appropriate procedure. So making sure that you're thinking, well, it's open because this is straightforward. I'm not going to negotiate on the terms of the contract. The other point I've mentioned on this slide is standardising your conditions of participation. So going back to that point I raised earlier about kind of what your minimum requirements are, do have a think about, well, actually this particular requirement is straightforward, simple. Therefore, to save you going through that process and thinking what actual conditions of participation are appropriate, do consider whether or not there's a standardization you can take to this approach. So, for example, you might think, well, this is our minimum assurance levels for this value of contract, or similar to central government, where they classify contracts as gold, silver, and bronze, and they have different requirements depending on which classification it falls within. you could take the same approach for conditions of participation, provided obviously you're complying with your own governance and contract procedure rules for that. So now it's talking about competitive flexible. So again, this is a summary slide to the general position of the competitive flexible procedure. And the key takeaways from this slide is, as we sort of discussed earlier, there's no your sort of guardrails have been removed. So no longer do you have to think about, well, this is the PCR, and you get lawyers telling you you're actually following a competitive dialogue and not a competitive procedure with negotiation, because there are obviously nuances between them. It now allows you to get rid of that and think what is appropriate for your particular procurement. And we'll go on to a little bit more detail on that particular point, but effectively you can down select. There are still minimum time frames for initial tenders. As I said, there's no prescribed structure or process, and you have to have proportionate conditions of participation. So going back to what we mentioned earlier, you might think, well, actually, when we're doing competitive flexible procedure, then that's what we would class as gold contracts, and therefore we have our set of proportionate conditions of participation. And again, you may kind of refine, just as you could with the other sort of down selecting procedures under the PCR, the number of participants that you take for each stage. And so the next slide just talks again about the modifying. I'll just sort of let you sort of read to the slide, because it doesn't really say much more in terms of the general principles we talked about already about kind of modifications, but just so you have it. So still thinking about, well, there's a position where you may modify it, but then you will have to consider revising the tender notice, revising the tender documents, and then thinking about, well, actually, now we need to extend the timeframes as a result. So I've included this slide really for completeness, just to cover the kind of, there is a nuance between modifications to a procedure under the open procedure and modifications to the competitive flexible procedure. So that's just to really call that out and make sure that you have that in mind if you're thinking about, oh, crikey, we now need to amend some documents. So I think the thing that I probably want to spend a bit more time on is the key considerations and kind of the current practice. So again, as you've probably as you no doubt appreciate, it's for those more complex sourcing needs. So in your ITT, effectively, what you'd be sort of setting out is the precise stages, and we'll sort of I'll talk to that in the next slide. But the key now, instead of saying to bidders, okay, crikey, we're now following the competitive dialogue procedure, you're now having to say we're now following the competitive flexible procedure, and these are the steps that we're going to take. So it's being super clear with the market. In a way, and I'll mention it later, it becomes a bit of a double-edged sword, because you're having to really specify what it is you'll do. So again, the other key point to this, I'm talking to the second bullet point there, is you can introduce negotiation, you can introduce dialogue, but again, making sure that these are set out in the ITT. And then finally, that last point on this particular slide is thinking about the conditions of participation. So this is where I then get quite heated. If anything from this slide that I would want you to take away from it is that second one, which is, as I was sort of saying, although there's no guide rules, the fundamental mitigation approach from I guess, even from a commercial perspective, from a lawyer perspective, is literally say what you're going to do and you do it. When you start departing from that route, that's where you then start creating the legal risk. So, for example, in a competitive flexible procedure, you have set out the stages you want to do. You say, okay, well, at stage 3, we want to now run presentations. We want to run some site visits. We might want to have best and final offer following initial tenders. Provided that you've had that time, so going back to what we're talking about on preliminary market engagement, thinking about your process, what is appropriate for the market, what is proportionate for the market. We then come down and say, well, okay, this is how we're going to design it to make sure that we get most advantageous tender, not me, as you all know. So it's one of those things where it can be, it's freeing because competitive flexible procedure doesn't have any guide rails, but also quite restrictive. It's a double-edged sword because not only, although you have the freedom to say what you want to say for bidders in order to determine how you get to where you want to get to toward the contract, price proportionate, etc., you need to really be clear about what steps you're going to follow in order to do that. Any exercise of discretion is always going to come with legal risk. So, for example, I was talking earlier about the economic and financial standing. What I tend to see is that tends to be a bit more kind of dark arts, and there will be an element where it's because it's always been dealt with, say, a particular department. There might not necessarily be that crossover between this is what our finance people do to make sure that they're happy with the financial viability of a particular bidder versus this is what we're going to do to procurement to make sure they're suitable. So making sure everyone is talking to each other about this is how we get to our successful bidder. And then finally on this slide, just that last bullet point is, yes, you have the flexibility, and yes, you'll have an ITT that sets out the various stages that you're going to go in a nice, clear way and how you're going to evaluate, but also thinking about those wider documents and how they fit into the process. So, for example, in a world where you had an invitation to participate, so you shortlisted following a selection questionnaire, you're then issuing an NDA to make sure that you can then share with them any commercially sensitive stuff that will be important to inform their bid. So it's thinking about at what point should we share the NDA? Make sure that we say that there's an NDA. So you might have, for example, employee data that comes with data protection issues. So making sure that you're getting your participants to enter into an NDA before you share that, and that it's got sufficient data protection provisions, so you're not doing it in contravention of data protection law. I'm a procurement lawyer, I don't need data protection, but effectively that makes sure you've got the right provisions in there. And then the other side of things is, as you see in the on the side, is that yes, you've now got these fantastic WYSI presentations, these site visits, these kind of dialogues with your bidders, but making sure you're then saying, well, okay, well, we now need to issue an agenda for what we're going to talk about. We now need to set out precisely what is the parameters, how is it going to be conducted, and so that documentation doesn't necessarily sit nicely within the ITT at all times, because it might just be a simple agenda and this is what we're going to talk about. It might obviously be part of your evaluation methodology, but do have a think about not just this is the ITT. We also need to think about what is the documents that sit around it, and so ethical rules agreements, for example, as well, fall within this category. So my next slide is all about just the open frameworks and dynamic markets. I won't go over this in too much detail, only that I suppose from an open frameworks, as kind of Claire's mentioned it, in terms of that kind of opening and reopening, if you think that you want the kind of the halfway house between the framework and the newly named dynamic market, then open framework is perhaps where you want to go to. But Claire and I are, we work with clients in order to work out actually how that would operate in practice. So something we talk about quite a lot with clients is that kind of how you're actually going to decide from the first open framework to the second open framework whether you can passport that individual onto the second part. And this question comes up quite a bit. So it's quite challenging, because clearly this again comes back to our holistic approach. It comes back to our preliminary market engagement, and so making sure that we have a position that effectively doesn't create stumbling blocks for those bidders that are already on the open framework that might actually be eligible, let's call it that, for the second open framework. And apologies if you're unfamiliar with open frameworks. Effectively, you have a new framework each time it's reopened, and you can then allow your suppliers that were on the previous framework to come onto the new framework because they submit by reference to their previous tender. But do have a think about that in practice and what that means for your particular service delivery, and whether actually that's something that might cause you a bit of heartache. So I think with open frameworks, yes, new tool to be able to use, but does it actually meet what you want it to do? Or is it effectively you actually want more of a demo market, or do you just want a framework I don't know if you've got any reflections on
Yeah,
that.
I think with the open framework, it's really interesting because some markets, so you're sort of thinking about you could do with reopening from a commercial perspective every year or even more often. But actually, your procurement team or whoever's doing it is going to have to deal with that every single time. So if you have a lot of suppliers on your framework and they all want their tender to be reassessed, and you're doing that every 8 months, you know, that's a huge burden. So I think this is what we're talking about, the planning and really thinking about the knock-on effects in the holistic way as to your reach procurement.
Absolutely, and I think nail on the head is that resources, because again, that's something that comes up quite a lot when we're talking about procedures. Is what's the quickest one that we can do? So that's often the question that we ask, and what is the one that means it's the less effort for us? And again, that not only are we thinking about what responses you're requiring from a bidder, so what evaluation methodology you're using and what responses you want, but also for your side saying, well, actually, we're now opening this framework. We now need to evaluate up to hundreds suppliers if obviously you have a very healthy competition, and what that means effectively for your capacity.
I think when you're doing that as well, we've had a discussion recently about award criteria and how you deal with that and making it easy for to ask the sorts of questions which are going to make it easier for the assessors to actually work with. So we're doing a lot of holistic work, haven't we, on that recently?
And it's it comes back as well as that duty for SMEs to have regard to SMEs. So it's almost as though you need to always have just regard to your general Section 12 duties, the NPPS current version, when you're designing. It sounds like, well, of course, I've been doing procurements for years, and I know exactly what I want to do, and this is how I've done it. And yes, that can still work. So it's really when you're thinking, okay, can we do this differently and use the kind of benefits of the Procurement Act to be more flexible using the competitive flexible procedure? Is there anything that we need to think about the market, like the SME point? So I think it fundamentally comes back down to the record keeping and making sure that you're then keeping a good track of why you've made a particular decision. Again, that's one of the key mitigation points in the event of an aggrieved bidder sending you a strongly worded letter to kind of justify your decision making. And if you've got that all in one place, it makes things much straightforward. And I do have there on the slide about dynamic markets, but I won't go too much than what we've already talked about, because I think it kind of speaks for itself. So I've just summarised some key points about below threshold on this slide. So as Claire's mentioned earlier, obviously you're looking at a slightly less regulated regime for below threshold contracts. One of the key parts here is that yes, less regulation, but as you'll all no doubt be screamingly aware, do make sure you're complying with your contract procedure rules and your governance rules. Obviously, if your governance rules require certain, like go out to a shortlisting when it's below threshold, there may not necessarily be a requirement to publish an initial below threshold tender notice. But if you're going to the market generally, then there will be, and making sure that you're doing that in a consistent way. So similar to under the old rules, if you're going to put a tender notice out there because you're advertising to the market generally, make sure you do that on the central digital platform via below threshold tender notice first before you then anywhere else effectively. And there's then obviously the obligation to publish a contract details notice where it exceeds 30k for subcentral authority. So again, under the same position as the PCR in terms of publication of contracts.
Right, thanks, Mike. So I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about contract management, which I think is it's been expanded quite a lot under the Procurement Act, and I think it'd be really helpful, particularly to think about KPIs. But to start with, we'll just have a think about some key concepts when we think about contract management of your contract. So the Section 12 duties do apply throughout the life of your contract. You have to bear those in mind as you're going through. To point out that conflict assessments, you do need to revisit those through the lifetime of your contract, particularly to look at your conflict assessments if you're going to be amending your contract and serving a notice. So that's important. Part 4 of the PA is where you can find all the details about managing public contracts. We have to publish contracts that exceed £5 million, subject to certain exemptions for confidentiality. We've got to deal with KPIs for contracts worth over 5 million, and we've got a number of implied terms that will be implied into your contract, including electronic invoicing, payment terms of subcontracts, and also the implied right to terminate. Now, I personally like to draft in implied terms into my contract so that everybody knows where they are, but they are implied, albeit we hope that they do end up being included in your contract documentation. So I think first looking at KPIs. So a KPI, of course, is a factor or measure against which the supplier's performance of a contract can be assessed during the life cycle of your contract. And this will apply to contracts that exceed £5 million. And you will, of course, need to set your 3 KPIs before you enter into the public contract, because it will be included in your contract documents at the outset. The section doesn't apply to a contract that's a framework or a concession contract or a light touch contract. But of course, your contracts, your light touch contracts will have KPIs in them. It just means that this regime of reporting isn't going to apply to you if your contract is light touch. You don't have to set the 3 KPIs if you think that they're not going to be appropriate. And I think the most obvious case would be a supply of goods. Once you get the goods and they're okay, the contract's over. So KPIs are probably not going to be necessary or appropriate there. And if you've decided that your KPIs are not appropriate and you haven't got any, then the guidance, the KPI guidance published by government has said that there's no need to publish contract performance notices in that circumstance. KPIs have also got to be included in your contract details notice, and we'll have a quick look at that about publishing KPIs in a little bit more detail now. And I've set it out on the slide, but there's quite a lot of words on the slide, but I think it's just helpful to have a think about it. So where more than 3 KPIs have been set under your section 52.3 duty, you do need to publish all of those KPIs. So that would normally be satisfied because you have to publish a contract that's over £5 million anyway. So that publication requirement will likely be met. If you haven't done that, then you need to publish those KPIs in another way. And the guidance suggests that the contract's details notice might be the appropriate place to put that. There is an additional requirement. So there's 2 separate, as you like, publishing requirements in relation to these KPIs. The additional requirement is found in the procurement regulations, and I've set the regulation out there on the slide. And that's essentially requiring that you publish your KPIs in the contract's details notice. So that's those 3 KPIs that you're required to set. Need to go in the contract's details notice. That's whether you publish the contract or not. It is a separate requirement. This is where we get, I think, it is a little bit confusing, and also the guidance on the KPIs isn't the clearest set of guidance that have been published. So the guidance is saying, and this is where we go back to the fact that the guidance isn't actually statutory guidance, but it is there and the government has published it. So, well, what we found is that if you pick through it, where there's gaps in the Act and the regulations, the guidance almost fills the gap, even though the legislation doesn't say it. So we'll have to wait to see how that's dealt with when these things start to go to court. But it is just worth mentioning that as an overall point. So the guidance is saying that the description of your 3 KPIs that need to go into that contract details notice are the KPIs you think are most material at the time of service of that contract's details notice. So when you've gone out to tender, you've picked your 3 KPIs, they go in the contract's details notice at the most material at that point. But they then go on to say that what is material, or the most material KPIs, are likely to change over the life of the contract. And this is where the guidance, I think, says slightly different things, and it's not entirely clear what's intended. So at the top half of the guidance, we have a comment, and I've put it there on the slide, to say that the additional KPIs should be included in the contract's details notice, and you can use the free text box in the KPI description field to do that. So what that's saying effectively is if you've got lots of KPIs, you put them in there. However, at the bottom of the guidance, we have another comment which says that in the contract's details notice, you publish 3 KPIs most material to the performance of the contract obligations at the time the contract details notice is published, as well as the 3 most material to performance over the lifetime of the contract where they're different. So that seems to indicate you can have 3 KPIs that are relevant now and the 3 KPIs that you think might be relevant in the future. It seems to be saying that there needs to be 3. It's not clear quite how many KPIs they want you to put. So I think you probably find the safest way is that if you have a number of KPIs in your contract that you think are really, really key, is to put them all in your contract details notice, because then at least you've published them.
Yeah.
And you can't, I think transparency, if in doubt, transparency has got to be the way to go. And we come on to this slide to talk a little bit more about that with the slight confusion around the KPIs. So one of the reasons for having the KPIs and publishing those is that you then have to publish your contract performance notice assessment of performance. So this can be found in section 71 and also regulation 39. And it's helpful to read both of those sections because they're not particularly descriptive in either the Act or the regulations, and the guidance almost plugs the gap. So I think this is definitely one of those circumstances where you do need to read the 3 things together. So your contract performance notice is to be served at least once in every period of 12 months and then again on termination. And then we think about what needs to go in it. So the assessment of performance notice will contain things, and you can find what details you need to plug in there in regulation 39. And what you're essentially going to be doing is assessing the performance of your supplier against the KPIs where you have set them in accordance with section 52(1). Again, the guidance has said that you need to publish an assessment of the performance against the 3 KPIs that are most relevant at the time the contract performance notice is published. And the guidance again says that those might be different to the ones that you set out in the contract details notice. So there is, I have to say, it isn't explicit from the Act that that is what the case, that is the case. But that is what it is saying in the guidance. The guidance then goes on to say that where there's fewer than 3 KPIs that you've set that you think are material when you're doing that assessment of performance, you could consider amending them subject to section 74. Now, of course, if you're in the life of your contract and you haven't provided already that your KPIs can be amended, then your supplier is probably unlikely going to agree to that amendment. So I think you have to work on the basis that you won't get supplier agreement when you're setting your KPIs at the outset. So that leaves the question of what do you do? And I think that the key to this is going to be really clear in your contract document, in your ITT, what you're intending to do. So I'm thinking particularly for things like very, very long contracts where you may have provisions to amend KPIs as you go along, or things like IT contracts where it's going to be material in year 1 that IT system is delivered, installed appropriately. But then in year 2, once that's happened, you're going to be more interested in the service. So what can you do? So what you could do is if you have a contract like an IT contract, is at the outset, you might know what your 3 KPIs are at the outset, and you know that when you're in life you're going to have 3 KPIs that are unlikely to change. Then in accordance with the guidance, publish those and everybody knows where they stand, including your supplier, because we'll come on in a minute to what happens if they're not performing well. So it's going to all come to a head, I suspect, if you're starting to publish notices to say that your contractor isn't effectively performing. So be really clear at the outset. If you have a contract where you have KPIs which are going to change over a period of 20 years and you've built things into your contract to say that, what I would say is in your contract, make it really clear to your supplier that if those KPIs are amended, they may be publishable and you may think that they're material at a particular point, and that at your discretion you will be publishing those, just so that everybody knows exactly where they stand and you don't end up in a world of difficulty down the line with disagreements about what's material and what's not. So I think that really, other than being entirely clear, it would be really nice, I think, when we get into the process of this to work out what practice emerges, and we might end up with some case law down the way, which does solidify this, or the guidance might be amended to make it a little bit clearer.
It's really tricky, isn't it? Because it's one of those things where no doubt a supplier doesn't want the world to know that they're not performing
Exactly.
like KPI. But remembering that you as the contracting authority effectively hold the pen.
Yeah.
You've got the publication requirements, etc., and it's your contract. So it's really, I guess, remembering that position and making sure that position is properly reflected in the contract.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, and if you can let the suppliers know at the outset that that's the case. Interestingly, the guidance does say that if you no longer have 3 KPIs that you think are material, that you can amend them. And when you do amend them, they recommend that when you publish them on the system, you say that they've been amended. So I don't know what that'll look like from your point of view for the people that are plugging that in, but apparently there's a free text box that you can put in if your KPIs have been amended. So I think it's a case of watch this space, but if in doubt, be incredibly clear with everybody as to what you're intending to do. Which leads me on to the second sort of contract performance notice. So this is again called a contract performance notice, but this is, sorry, that's the assessment of performance. I've just sort of slightly jumped ahead. If I go back, when you're assessing performance of a KPI, you have to do it in the categories that are set out in the regulations. So it doesn't mean that in your contract you have to be grading or rating or suppliers in these boxes. But when you do your assessment of performance and you publish that notice, you do have to rate the supplier in accordance with those boxes. It does rather seem to me that if your contract and this align, it's going to be a little bit easier. If your contract has got KPIs which are wholly different to these ratings, I think that's just going to make life quite tricky going forward.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a think of your KPIs in terms of this tiering approach? Because yeah, if you can set out the banding of which would then qualify for good, approaching target, etc., it's again less of an argument when you're publishing, if particularly for suppliers, if it says requires improvement, you can point straight to your contractual rights and say, look, it's because it's within this banding.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's just it's room for confusion, I think, going forward. So if we go forward again, so contract performance notice, this is the second type of contract performance notice that is to be served under the Act. And this is where there's been a breach or a failure to perform, provided the contract isn't terminated. So on the slide, I've got the 2 triggers essentially for the service of this notice. The first one is where there's been a breach by the supplier of the contract, and the breach has resulted in the things on the slide. So termination or partial termination for the purposes of this notice, the award of damages or a settlement. And the second set of circumstances are failure to perform under section 71(4), which is if you as a contracting authority consider that a supplier is not performing a public contract to your satisfaction, has been given proper opportunity to improve performance and has failed to do so. So when either of these, the first of these trigger dates that happen, you then have to serve your notice within 30 days. So just a couple of points that we've come across to flag here. The first column on the slide talks about breach, and it says a supplier has breached. Of course, a supplier might disagree that they've breached. So whether there has been a breach will certainly be up for dispute, I would have thought. And particularly in settlement agreements, you may well say the supplier doesn't agree there's been a breach. So it just query whether going forward there's going to be some issues there around whether there's been a breach or not. In a way, the second one, the failure to perform, is a little bit easier in the sense that that's within your gift. So the contracting authority in this case considers that a supplier is not performing, has been given proper opportunity to improve, and then has failed. What I would say on that is it's going to be really key to deal with your remediation provisions in your contracts, to say exactly what happens, the process that happens, the steps that will be taken to improve. Note that it says the supplier has to be given proper opportunity to improve. So what that looks like will depend on what's in your contract. So it's just really worth thinking about that at the outset when you're doing your contract drafting.
So in that respect, you're talking about kind of the remediation plans or rectification plans.
Yes, absolutely. And what steps might be proper, what gives them proper opportunity. So if you're saying you have to remedy something within 5 days, which is completely unrealistic, then that might not be a proper opportunity to improve. So it will require some thought. Otherwise, you'll end up in a world of argument in the future. If you've had a breach of contract and it ends in the contract being terminated, then you do need to serve a contract termination notice. And on the slide, we talk about that. And as we alluded to earlier, that does include also if the contract simply expires, you do have to do that. There's a little NB at the bottom of the slide as well to say that apparently on termination of the contract, the contract performance notice setting out your final assessment of contract performance has to be published before the contract termination notice. And the reason being that if you serve a contract termination notice, it effectively closes the record on the central digital system. So that's just a flag that I picked up from the guidance that I think you could end up in a world of difficulty if you don't heed that. Just quickly come on to excluded or excludable. Mike spoke about debarment a little bit earlier on, and we're now talking, I'd like to talk about this in the context of contract management, because I think it is quite important, particularly when we look at the effects of this. So a supplier could be excluded if one of the mandatory exclusionary grounds applies, and they're all listed in section 6 at the back of the PA. So if one of those grounds apply and either those circumstances are continuing or likely to occur again, or they're on the debarment list, they can be excluded. A supplier is excludable, and this is a discretionary exclusion ground if either circumstances are continuing or likely to occur again, or are on the suppliers on the debarment list for discretionary exclusion grounds. And the next slide, we talk about what a discretionary exclusion ground looks like. But the effect of a supplier being deemed to be excluded or excludable is on the right-hand side. So at the start of the contract, they could be disregarded. But actually, what's really important from the contract management point of view is that there is an implied right to terminate where a supplier becomes excluded or excludable during the term of the contract. And our advice would be to put that actually in the contract as a term. So that's quite powerful. So particularly when we think about excludable, discretionary exclusion grounds, if they apply in the life of the contract, then that contract can be terminated, which is quite a big thing. It's particularly if we have a look at these excludable grounds. So they're in Schedule 7, but on the slide I've just put them there because actually paragraph 12 of that Schedule 7 deals with if there's lack of contract performance. So what they're saying is that if the supplier's breached a relevant contract, and that's a contract with a public authority generally, not just with you. So if a supplier has breached a relevant contract and the breach was sufficiently serious, the courts ruled that there's been a breach. If the supplier hasn't performed the contract to your satisfaction or a public authority's satisfaction, was given the proper opportunity to improve and failed to do so, there is a potential for there to be a discretionary exclusion ground. The rub is, though, that the result has to be sufficiently serious, and that's also on the slide. So the breaches listed in the top half of the slide must result in one of these things at the bottom. So the breach has to result in termination, award of damages, or a settlement agreement between the supplier and the regulated authority. Again, flag, has there been a breach of contract? Is the settlement as a result of the breach? I'm thinking there could be some quite interesting debates about that, particularly when you think all public contracts with public bodies could be terminated on a discretionary ground if a supplier has been found that they haven't performed the contract properly, and there's a settlement or there's a termination of the contract.
Yeah, I guess so. On the settlement agreement side, making sure that you're working with your litigation colleagues if they're the ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that there is that kind of publication requirements in the settlement agreement. And come back to what you were saying earlier, Claire, about making sure that your contract's super clear in terms of making sure you have sufficient rights as a contracting authority to go through this process, and that you're reducing the risk of having an argy-bargy.
I think it's incredibly important, and it winds all the way back to thinking about KPIs, what they are, what a breach looks like, what the rectification process is going to be in your contract, and being incredibly clear at every stage what that is, so that if you're in this world of there being a breach, discretionary exclusion ground could apply. You know, I would imagine your suppliers are going to be fighting tooth and nail to avoid that situation. So the clearer you can be, the better. We're coming to the end now, Mike. If you do have any questions, again, please put them in the chat. And Mike's just going to finish up talking about social value, which is a hot topic.
Yeah. So I think the sort of starting point I set out on this slide is the National Procurement Policy Statement. So you have a duty to have regard to this statement. And I've extracted on the slide there the kind of key social value aspects that are kind of highlighted in the most recent version of the NPPS. And I think as a starting point as well, thinking about, okay, well, is it something, how do we actually deliver it? Is it what kind of what level of importance does it have to us as a contracting authority, as a kind of driver for contracting authority policies, and really kind of thinking how you can kind of incorporate social value metrics or kind of ESG, I guess, so environmental, social, and kind of governance to this extent into your contract. So clearly, this is something that's obviously more of a kind of policy spin to it, and I think that comes across when we look into effectively the legal position under the sort of when you can incorporate social value kind of award criteria into your contract. So I've kind of set out here that yes, you've got the duty to regard, and we've talked about kind of record keeping earlier on. So once you've had regard to that, making a nice clear decision written down preferably on your approach to then incorporating social value and how you've had regard to that under the NPPS. Obviously, that's part of your kind of documents on the side. It's not necessarily something that you'd be sharing with bidders. I mean, from a transparency perspective, you can always do that and say, this is the reason why we've got this particular question within our evaluation methodology on social value, and this is why we've given it a certain percentage. But the key from a legal perspective is that you effectively tick the boxes for what is a lawful award criteria. So I've set that on the slide here. So when thinking about social value, it's not necessarily great they can employ a certain number of apprentices or they can do a certain amount of kind of sessions. It's has to be related to the subject matter of the contract. So your starting point is always thinking, well, yes, it's very laudable. It's very important that we consider social value in certain contracts. But within the legal framework, it's thinking about how do these relate to the delivery of the services we're actually doing. So I guess, for example, you could say that we want pens and that we want to know in terms of the delivery of the pens, the kind of the sustainability for creating the plastics of the pens. Obviously, there's some nuances around there, but just to take a high level kind of comment to think about it. The next point on social values, what I often see is that they have to be sufficiently clear, measurable, and specific. So when you're thinking about your questions for getting that social value response, giving at least a guide to what you're expecting bidders to kind of hit the points to give you a kind of excellent answer, and then so you can judge from there downwards to say, well, I haven't hit point 2, so therefore we can sort of mark them down, or in the usual way that you would evaluate responses. The third point is that they don't break the rules. The break the rules is a direct lift from the Act, and I do come out in hives every time I say that because that is what the law says. But break the rules effectively is they comply with the requirements of technical specifications. So no new change there for what you had under the PCR. Basically, as I've said there, make sure your specification is function based and avoid saying brands, like Xerox printers or whatever. And then finally, that last point is there are proportionate means of assessing tenders. And this really comes down to, if you're asking a social value question, what is the point effectively to your contract? Why are you asking this question? Is it just for information? In which case, then why would you want to include it? And that leads me to the final point in this slide, is that the social value model, as you may have seen, that applied to under the PCR to central government bodies has been carried over, updated, because the references now to COVID, for example, have been removed, and it's been updated to reflect the current political environment. But as a sub-central authority, no requirement to comply with it, but you still may use the approach. So I would, if you're not familiar with the social value model, do have a look at it. I know that there are obviously other models out there, for example, the TOMS, and so really think about your toolkit for when you're asking questions on social value. So if you're not familiar with the social value model, effectively it sets out certain themes, and you pick the theme, and then you go down effectively that theme that gives you then what kind of questions you can ask, and eventually at the under it says this is the actual measurement within the contract that you can use because you've chosen this particular metric. So it's quite sort of straightforward and leads you down a bit of a garden path in terms of what's the question we need to ask, what's the theme, and how do we measure it, and then what needs to be in the contract. So if you're not familiar with it, would definitely recommend a bit of a Google and do have a look at that PPN and the associated social value model. And so the key takeaways for social value are: do consider your duties under the NPPS as I kind of set out, so that even though the language is quite, well, clearly it's quite broad and fluffy, do think how you can demonstrate you've had regard to it. So thinking about this is what we want to achieve in a particular contract, and have a think about the PPN where it sets out the social value model. Then thinking about the evaluation questions, making sure that they're focused on the particular subject matter of the contract. To be precise in your social value question. Don't just leave them to give you an answer, because this leads on to my third point within this thing, is that making sure that your evaluation team has the necessary expertise to be able to evaluate social value responses. So it's all very well, again, asking for all the very laudable stuff, but making sure you're kind of getting targeted responses so you can fairly and objectively evaluate the responses. If you're looking to outsource the evaluation of social value, do be clear on the responsibilities of that outsourcing supplier who will be doing that evaluation for you and what you're expecting back from them. It can be really challenging if you're in a position where you've outsourced this and effectively you're then having to kind of find out how things were undertaken, what was the reasoning for the actual particular scoring methodology, because ultimately you as the contracting authority have responsibility for the procurement, even if you outsource an element of the evaluation. So if you're outsourcing the evaluation of the social value, you're still effectively on the hook, as it were, because you're the one going out to procure. So do make sure that you've really understood, if you're outsourcing it, what the relationship and what the expectations are between you and the outsourcing party that's going to help you do the social value evaluation. Again, check and challenge the response requirements. So all that means there is that when you're setting out your question, have a reflection about, are we hitting the right points of what we need? Are we still sticking within the rules as I set out in the previous slide about award criteria having to meet those particular metrics? And then finally, as I mentioned for the social value model, how do you actually monitor those social value commitments? So yeah, great, they've given you loads of social value commitments and you've popped it in the back end of the contract. End of story? Not quite. You need to still think about, well, if we can measure it, yeah, there might not be an enforcement regime around it, but if you've asked for it in the first place, what's the harm in then having KPIs to actually reflect what they're doing during the life of it?
Well, it might not be a material KPI.
Yeah.
I think we have one question which I will come to because it's a really good question. But just to say, do remember with your NPPS, it doesn't override your Section 12 duties. So the Section 12 duties are sit there and have a slightly uneasy thing about with social value, thinking about your SMEs and breaking down barriers. If you have a multinational promising the earth, the SMEs social value is not likely to be the same. So it's just it's a balance, and it's important to just, I think, just as a final, but thank you.
Thank you.
It's really interesting for me as well to listen to the points on social value. Just looking at this construction contract question, there is a bit of an anomaly with construction contracts with the values. So if you have a look at the Act, and I've got it in front of me, so just so I can sort of read it out to you. So Section 3 defines a public contract as a public contract which has an estimated value of not less than the threshold amount for the type of contract. Construction contracts, of course, are at 5.3 something million at the moment as a starting value to be covered by the Procurement Act. So in theory, a construction contract under that value is not covered. So a construction contract of 5 million wouldn't actually be covered by this Procurement Act, which is odd. I have to say, I find that quite odd. But in terms of KPIs, the KPIs in your construction contract are the KPIs for the purposes of the contract. So effectively, you need to pick the 3 KPIs which are the most material at the time that you're publishing your contract details notice. Pick the top 3, and if you think that they're going to be changing over time, pop in the other ones in your contract details notice so that you can rotate them as you need to. Just because they're in a standard form contract doesn't mean that that isn't the contract for the purposes of the KPIs. And I think that's if whoever answered that question, Karen, thank you for that, because that's a really good question. And if you did want to ask anything else about that or follow up, then just please do let us know.
I always feel a bit cautious with construction contracts as well, because we're talking about contracts over 5.3 million inclusive of that. So if that difference between 300,000 and being below threshold, I think I'd take the cautious approach.
Yeah, me too. I think it's a really odd, I don't know, it's not very helpful, I don't think, from a clarity point of view. And I totally agree with Mike that if in doubt, apply the Act with your construction contracts if the values are looking a little bit tight.
Yeah. So so we'll just pop that side to any other questions. And if you obviously you will have seen at the start of this, there is a feedback survey, so the link is in the chat. So do please complete that at your leisure. And we'll just wait for a moment if there's any other questions coming through. Otherwise, we'll draw.
Well, thank you very much for attending and spending the this morning with us to talk about procurement. If you do have any questions, you can always email us after the session's finished. We'll give it a minute, but then that'll be goodbye from us.
Yeah, hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you for all the claps. It's very much appreciated. It's always nice to see in these kind of scenarios where we're sort of talking to a screen without seeing your faces.
Yes,
so
I'd like to learn how to do the clap.
Yes.
I think I'll get Mike to show me how to do that actually at the end. It's from our perspective, for those of you that are still on the call, we can see little claps hovering up at the bottom of our screen, which is quite nice.
So just to reiterate that point, then, if you've got any questions, obviously feel free to get in touch. I think our contact details are on the slides that will be circulated. That's an interesting image. Yes, thanks again for your time. Have a lovely afternoon.